Hi, and welcome back. So, today we're going to move our discussion into a different region. Primarily, when we're talking about the Gilded Age economy, we're talking about the Northeast. So, today we're going to look at what was going on in the South. And we're using the term the New South to differentiate it from the Old South, the South of the pre Civil War era. A lot of historians have argued that the New South, this whole idea of a New South, was a failure. So after Reconstruction, the people who had been in charge, either literally the same people or very similar people, regained control in the South. Now, they wanted different things than they did in the Old South. But the things that they want are things like industrialization. They want to try to bring the South up on par economically with the North. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen until after World War II. And so historians have looked at why did the New South fail, this idea of a society trying to come out of agriculture. A lot of it has to do with those guys who get their power back and the system that's put in place, particularly the social and racial system that affects everybody living in the South. So ask yourself throughout this presentation, why is the New South considered a failure by historians, and is that a fair assessment of this South? So, in general, we are talking about a society in which these old elites regain control, but they are trying to change the economy. But they want to change the economy while keeping the same social and racial hierarchy. In terms of changing the economy, the South remains a primarily agricultural economy during this period up until 1920. That doesn't mean that agriculture lost its primary position, this effort to try to industrialize. What we see in terms of the Southern economy is that agriculture remains the primary way people are making money, but how labor is set up changes. So after the Civil War, slaves were freed, but they're not given much else. No land, no money. So the landowners have land, but no one to work it. And so we get sharecropping. Now, sharecropping had been around for a while, but not a lot of people in the South participated in it. Sharecropping, think of sharecropping in the same way you think of a lease for an apartment. You get a contract usually for a year for an apartment, and you pay each month. So sharecropping is like that. You're renting land, but instead of paying in money, you're paying in a share of the crop. And it is the same as a lease. It's for a year, and it is a contract. So a sharecropper enters into a contract with a landowner, has to stay the entire year, the entire growing season from planting to harvesting. So they plant the crop, they take care of it, and then they split the crop, usually 50-50 with the people they're renting the land from. And this is the primary way that former slaves supported themselves in the South, but it becomes something poor whites did as well. In 1880, a third of the farmers in the South were sharecroppers, and that's African American and white. In 1920, two-thirds of the farmers in the South were sharecroppers. A lot of this has to do with the fact that people don't have the ability to save money for their own land, and those who own land begin to lose it over time because the South is a very low-income region. Farmers don't make a lot of money, and they make progressively less money as this period goes on. Which brings us to the crop lien. Farmers don't have a lot of cash on hand. The only way to get money is to borrow, and there's not enough banks in the South. And the only way to get credit was something known as the crop lien. So the crop lien is credit on next year's crops. But usually you're paying in credit twice what you'd pay in cash because the interest rate is extravagantly high. There's a lot of cheating, particularly of illiterate people, and so interest rates are just astronomically high. And on top of that, the price of cotton is steadily falling. So you're betting on next year's crop, but you might get paid for your crop less than what you got paid the previous year. And because you're betting on next year's crop, you're just hoping that this crop is a good one. You don't have too much rain or not enough rain, no pests, no diseases of your crops. You're hoping everything goes well, and it usually doesn't. So often people are stuck in permanent debt. And so people who owned land used the crop lien too, and there's a huge amount of poverty in the South as a result of this debt. The average income in the South in 1900 was 40% of what it was in the North. Now there is industry, so there is some industry like those who were back in charge wanted. What industry there is corporations, and they tend to fall into three categories. So you have textile mills, usually worked by women and children, very comparable to what there was in the North. You also have tobacco. The cigarette machine was invented in 1876, which made smoking more accessible. The Duke family of North Carolina started a huge tobacco company and wound up by 1900 controlling 3/4 of the tobacco market. The third of the big businesses in the South was lumber. So the lumber industry became quite big in the South, particularly as new technologies allowed for the processing of southern pine, which they couldn't really do before. In terms of politics, society, and race, most whites were Democrats. Most African Americans voted Republican. Southern Democrats had a monopoly on power in the South. They were favored pro-business policies, so they're pro-industry, as we talked about earlier, but they also passed laws supporting the sharecropping system and crop liens. These are the wealthy white elites of the South who are in your state legislatures, who are running for governor, who generally are in control. They oppose active government. They try to cut government spending at every opportunity, including education. In fact, the government of Virginia said schools were not a necessity. Fewer people knew how to read by the 1880s than they did in the 1870s. Half of all African Americans could not read, and only 85% of whites could, which, if you compare it to the North, that's a pretty low number. However, through the 1880s, unlike what this political cartoon shows, race relations were not good in the South, but they were nowhere near as bad as what they were about to become. So during the 1880s in the South, African Americans voted at the same rate as whites. African Americans continued to be elected to Congress. This man pictured here, John Mercer Langston, was elected to the United States Senate in 1888 from Virginia. And he would be the last African American elected to the Senate from Virginia for almost an entire 100 years. And there was some separation of the races, but it wasn't by law. It's not until the 1890s that we have legal separation, what would become called Jim Crow. So why does this happen? What changes? So there's a couple of reasons, and they fall kind of under three broad categories: politics, economics, and social change. So first and foremost, you have an entire generation of young African Americans that are becoming adults that did not grow up under slavery. Some have gone to college, some have started businesses. You have the first African American millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. So these African Americans are behaving differently. They're not as afraid or deferential to whites as those who had grown up under slavery, and some whites are alarmed by this. You also have this new political party that we're going to talk about a bit more during this unit, the Populists. One of the goals of the Populists is to bring together poor whites and poor African Americans. They argue that wealthy people, capitalism is the problem, not race. And if that alliance happens between poor whites and poor African Americans, Southern Democrats are in trouble. And so, particularly Southern Democrats know that they have to do something about this, something specifically to disfranchise, to take away the vote from African Americans. So disfranchisement, taking away the vote. There's a couple of ways you can do this, and they're all very effective. You encourage literacy tests, so different tests for African Americans and for whites. Sometimes whites would get something very easy to read, African Americans would get chunks of the tax code or things in Chinese. You also had a poll tax, you had residency requirements, all white primaries so that African Americans can't choose who runs in the Democratic primary, and it's extremely effective. African American voter participation goes from 70% to 10%. We also see another way that there's increased racism between 1890 and 1920, the introduction of Jim Crow, or legal segregation. So everything that could be segregated was. There were separate train cars, stadiums, Bibles for being sworn in court, restrooms, schools, cemeteries. From birth to death, things were segregated in the South by law. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. So this ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. This is where we get that phrase, separate but equal. So Homer Plessy was from New Orleans. He was biracial. He was only 1/8 African American. He could pass as white. And he and civil rights groups in a civil rights group in New Orleans decided to challenge this separate train cars, white cars, African American cars. He got himself arrested on purpose for sitting in the white car. He argued that this violated the 14th Amendment. Goes to the Supreme Court and they lose. So instead of striking down segregation, we see an increase in Jim Crow laws after Plessy versus Ferguson. We also see an increase in racial violence between 1890 and 1920. 90% of all lynchings took place inside of the South. Now, a lynching, most people misunderstand lynching. A lynching is not a hanging. A lynching is any racially motivated murder. In the 1890s, 200 African American men were lynched per year. This is often intended as punishment for a crime, almost always a crime that's sexual in nature, usually an accusation of raping or attacking a white woman. These draw very, very large crowds. There's usually a celebratory atmosphere. It's often a picnic for whites. And it's also a way to discipline the African American community. This is a picture of one of the most famous lynchings. It took place in Waco, Texas in 1916. In 1916, Jesse Washington was accused of raping and murdering a white woman. He was very, very quickly convicted by an all-white jury and then taken outside. Jesse Washington was tortured. He was castrated, had fingers cut off, and then he was lowered over a burning fire while alive for quite a long time before he finally died. The mob, as you might see, was quite pleased with themselves. Kids came, there was picnics. This is not actually a picture, this is a postcard. So the photographer made a lot of postcards out of this and sold it. So these are major events. This isn't something that's done in the dark of night. This isn't something that's done in secret. This is something that's done in the courthouse square with a lot of people showing up. So how do African Americans live with this? Segregation, disfranchisement, the threat of racial violence, all of these efforts to dehumanize them, to make them lose their dignity. For most African Americans, it's about keeping your head down, not drawing attention to yourself, and living a double identity. So having your true self that you use with your family and your community, and then the self that you show whites, which is very deferential, and always in an effort to not break any of these rules and codes that take place in the South. Now we can break the general response, the general effort to try to push back against these boundaries into two groups. The first group is represented by Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a Southerner, born in Virginia as a slave. His mother was a slave and his father was the white owner. He grew up, became very well educated, and founded the Tuskegee Institute. Washington argued that African Americans should focus on education as a means to self-improvement. The goal of education should be practical, aimed at some kind of trade, and there should be some kind of gradual approach to improving race relations. This is best shown in his Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895. Now, he didn't call it that. Other people call it the Atlanta Compromise speech. Now, this is to white businessmen. And in this speech, Washington says that segregation is unfortunate, but it's acceptable for the time being. Because as African Americans contribute to the economy and prove their worth over time, whites will recognize how much they contributed and realize that African Americans deserve rights. So this is a gradual approach. It's not about being antagonistic. It's not about fighting for your rights. It's about improving yourself, and eventually whites will honor that. W.B. Du Bois did not agree. W.B. Du Bois did not like Washington or his ideas. He was a Northerner from Massachusetts, the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He was a sociologist, one of the first of that field, specifically of African Americans. And he argued that education is the key to African American success, like Washington, but the point of education should be to train a new generations of African American leaders to fight for civil rights, not wait for white people to hand them out, because that was never going to happen. You have to fight for them. So Du Bois argues that this should have happened yesterday, that there shouldn't be any kind of gradual approach. And one of the ways that he does that is by being one of the founders for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The goal of the NAACP throughout the 20th century was to work through the court system to gain civil rights, because how can African Americans have dignity without legal equality? And so we're going to follow this struggle for civil rights for African Americans and other marginalized groups throughout the 20th century.